This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Coveil. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. Before I jump into my guest today, I want to put a big thank you out to you, the audience. Most recently, on iTunes, 2.5 years into my podcast, number 5 in the investing section, top 10 in the business section. Of course, all fame is fleeting, and you never know what's going to happen tomorrow. But top 5, I will take it. That puts Tim Ferriss, Dave Ramsey, James Altucher, the Motley Fool, ahead of me. Behind me, Jim Cramer, Susie Orman, Bill Gross at PIMCO, IBD Radio, Wall Street Journal Radio, NPR Radio. I will take that. Mike Coveil, no distribution behind him. Interesting, right? Says something about why does this podcast take off? It's not just me. Of course not. It's not just the guests, and they are great. It's that it's something different. It's not standard issue bullshit. My guest today is definitely not into standard issue anything. He is Ben Hunt. He's the Chief Risk Officer at Salient Partners. Salient is a $19 billion asset manager based in Houston, Texas. As Chief Risk Officer, Ben has been writing since last summer the Epsilon Theory, viewing capital markets through the lenses of game theory and history. Great papers, great insights. Yes, it's not exactly like my world, but the economics, the politics of it, the analysis of it, it's spot on. And like myself, like many smart people I know, Ben is not coming on to say, hey, this is what's going to happen tomorrow. No, he's laying out a probabilistic framework, a game theory framework where you can start to understand behavior. It's up to you to have the system. It's up to you to have the rules. It's up to you to know what to do next. But his analysis is great. I hope you enjoy. So I have to tell you, I've gone through all of your pieces of the Epsilon Theory since last summer. I've pulled all the PDFs down, and in front of me sits 4 pages of notes. Of course, I will not be able to get to all of them today because people are going to have to go read all of this if they really want to dig in. But I really like your perspective. And
thank you so much.
Yeah, you know, when I started going through your bio, I was like, political science professor at one point in time. That explains something why I liked you as a former poli-sci major.
Fantastic.
So, hey, listen, let me jump right in. So one of the things that you touch on, which I really love, and I want you to explain to the audience, and I'm going to kind of jump around today because you make some great points that for the attentive audience, they will see that this is all related, even though they might be coming from what seems like disparate vantage points. They're not to me, and maybe the way I'm jumping around they'll be. But anyways, here's the first thing.
I totally get it. Absolutely right.
Okay, so the power of the crowd watching the crowd. And I've seen you say, for your money, it's the most potent behavioral force in human society, the power of the crowd watching the crowd. Why don't you explain that, your perspective, what's going on there, why that's so important to you?
Sure. It's really at the heart of so much of modern, not just modern game theory, but the whole notion of strategic interaction. And what I mean by that, and this does go back to my background as a political science professor, and because my toolkit were the disciplines of econometrics, but also game theory. And game theory is so important, particularly for understanding political interactions. And what I mean by political interactions are human interactions, the interactions of individuals to individuals or crowds within themselves, crowds to other crowds. You see so much of this same sort of behavior taking place in financial markets. And so one of the large thrusts of the Epsilon Theory effort is to try to apply some of these lessons of game theory, some of the frameworks of game theory is probably a better way to say it, to market behaviors. And so I wanted to really introduce this notion of crowd behavior in financial markets by giving some examples of crowd behavior, the logic of crowd behavior in other venues, other areas of human activity. So that was the basis for this notion of really looking at the crowd, because that is I guess if there's one big principle of game theory when it comes to crowd behavior, it's that it's not to think of us as individuals within the crowd, simply listening to a leader and making our own individual decisions. We are social animals. And I mean that in the very technical sense of the word. I mean that in the biological sense of the word. And as social animals, we are hardwired to look around and to see how the other members of our group or tribe or crowd or market, whatever you want to call it, are responding to various communications and stimuli. And moreover, it's not just us responding to that. All of us are doing it simultaneously. And that creates a dynamic that I think game theory can help explain. So sorry for the long-winded introduction, but it's that is a major focus of what I try to look at.
Well, and I think you go to the idea that game theory can help to understand, help to explain, but some of the other notes that I've made here going through your work, but how we cope with this probabilistic ocean that we're setting sail in, our imperfect human view of the world. And, as you point out, it takes a certain intellect to be comfortable, and your phrasing is to being lost in the mysterious universe without any purpose. But that's kind of where we're at. So it's not something where, you're necessarily using game theory to say this is going to happen tomorrow. You're trying to come at this from a big 360-degree perspective to get people to take a step back and say, whoa, there is no certainty. There's only uncertainty.
Well, that's right, Mike. I don't have a crystal ball, and I'm very suspicious of people who say that they do. I think that's particularly true in periods of great political fragmentation. And I don't think we've seen this level of fragmentation both within and between countries at a fundamental political level since the 1930s. But because we don't have a crystal ball, because I don't know what's going to come out of Washington tomorrow, I don't know what's going to come out of Europe, I certainly don't know what's going to come out of China tomorrow. Because we don't have a crystal ball, I think the tendency is to, how shall I say this, either to flock to someone who says that they do have the answer, that they do have a functioning crystal ball, or simply to withdraw. And I think both of those alternatives are flawed. I think instead we can step back, as you described, and think about, well, whatever comes down the pike, whatever arises in this uncertain world, how do we react to that? How do we adapt to that? How do we think about the rules of how the crowd is likely to react to whatever comes down the pike? So what I'm really trying to do is to get people to step back, just as you said, and think for themselves about the messages that they're hearing, to understand that these messages will impact them, to understand that these messages and these signals will impact other participants in their market or their politics or whatever, again, organization you're talking about. And that they may very well want to go along with that message. It's not a, fighting the Fed or fighting anyone else that I'm trying to describe, but I am trying to describe that one should step back, not presume that there are any set paths or courses of action that the world might take, but to think rigorously about the rules of the game once a message or a signal or an event occurs.
Okay, let me let you, without naming any names. So one of the statements that I saw that you made, which I thought was fantastic, is that you reject the notion of any mechanistic model of how the world works in favor of a profound agnosticism about what the future holds. Now, there are some very well-known investors out there that have done exceptionally well, and they have theories about how the world works, and that it's a machine. And it's essentially put out that it's almost predictive, and the once you know the machine model, everything just unfolds into the future in a very systematic way. And I share your belief that there might be a reason why an investor, regardless of assets under management, has had some success. But I don't think that's the way the world works.
Well, I tell you, Mike, I think that it depends so much on what period of time you're living in. And what I mean by that is that I actually do think that models have more predictive power during periods of what I call risk as opposed to uncertainty. And those are two terms, risk and uncertainty, that have very specific meanings in game theory. So let me try to describe that for a second, because I think
break them apart.
It illustrates exactly what you're talking about. In game theory, a decision under risk is a decision where you have a rough sense of what the potential outcomes of the decision might be. And you also have a rough sense of the probabilities to assign to those potential outcomes. So if flipping a coin is a decision under risk, you know what the outcomes are, and you can describe with great accuracy what the odds are of those coin tosses. Decisions under uncertainty are very different. Decisions under uncertainty are where you really are not sure what the potential outcomes are, and you're darn sure, or you're certainly unsure of what the odds are of these unclear outcomes. The Donald Rumsfeld, the former defense secretary, often gets a bum rap for a lot of the things he says, but I really like one of his statements where he says, look, you have known knowns, you have known unknowns, and you have unknown unknowns. And he says it's the unknown unknowns that really keep me awake at night when I'm thinking about defense policy. Well, it's exactly the same thing when you're thinking about investment policy. I think it's the unknown unknowns, the uncertainty in a world of political fragmentation that one really has to worry about. And here's the kicker. All of modern economics, all of modern economic theory, portfolio theory, econometrics, every bit of it is based on decisions under risk, is based on a notion that we have a rough idea of what the potential outcomes are and what odds or probabilities to assign to those outcomes. So in periods of relative political calm, there's this reference to the great moderation, the monetary policy around stable growth, stable international economic and political systems between, say, the 1960s till, call it the early 2000s. That great moderation is a period of time where decisions under risk, where modeling really works pretty well. But conversely, it's periods like the 1930s, and I would argue the past 6 or 7 years, where modeling works very poorly. Why? Because the old patterns, the ability to say, oh, I know what's going to happen in this election, or I've got a good sense of what this company's or this industry sector's reaction will be to this monetary policy. Those days are long gone. The days of a more mechanistic approach, I think, will probably come back. They always do. These things wax and wane. But my argument is that just as in the 1930s, today it's very hard, or less useful, shall I say, to use these mechanistic models.
I detect a little bit of diplomacy there in the sense that when you're giving some props to the risk model, I think the audience is probably thinking, but okay, that's great, but how do we know to switch when it's uncertainty time? And I think that's part of the snafu there, isn't it?
Well, look, here's the thing, Mike. I don't think it's ever an either-or phenomenon. And here's what I want to do. For example, when you read about the great investors before World War II, here I'm thinking about the Carnegies, the Jay Goulds of the world, the Rockefellers. You read the memoirs of these guys, or you read guys writing about them. And I will tell you, not one of them ever discusses a discounted cash flow model, right? Not one of them ever talks about, what's the free cash flow yield of this security, and, how am I going to calculate my covariance matrix of this versus that? They're all talking about the game of markets. They're all talking about other investors' behavioral patterns that they take advantage of in markets. Now, does that mean that fundamentals and a rigorous modeling of cash flows and company fundamentals was not useful before World War II? Well, no, it was useful. And I can point you to some other guys like John Maynard Keynes, who's a very successful investor, who talks about cash flows and these fundamental modeling attributes. But by the same token, in today's world, it's not all modeling and econometric fundamental analysis either. It's always a mix of the two. And I think that one of the things that I think I'm tapping into is a general, or it's not acknowledgement, at least frustration with the degree to which a modeling approach dominates so much of investing theory and practice today. So I think it's always a mix of the two, and I think that unfortunately so much of the behavioral aspects, so much of the game theory aspects has been kind of put on a shelf, and it's high time I think we dust those off.
Let me shift gears on you a little bit. I've got the Panopticon design was a means of controlling the minds of prisoners or workers through mental force, as opposed to the traditional goal in 18th century prisons and workhouses of controlling bodies through brute force. And as I saw you making that case in some of your writing, I couldn't help but think of the movie The Matrix.
Yeah.
And I'm sure I was guessing, okay, he said I've been thinking the same thing. But why don't you walk that through? It's a fairly, I'm not a negative person. I'm optimistic. I'm a positive guy. I love my life. I have fun. I work hard. But I'm also a realist, and I can look at what some of these systems that have been put in place. And for example, if we were to talk about the bureaucratic system that's in place in Washington, D.C. area, and I grew up in that area, its tentacles just extend and extend and extend. And it seems those tentacles just give rewards, and they keep people in almost a suspended animation, a matrix-like type place. What is your thought process there? That was a great example of the Panopticon. What were you thinking?
Well, let me take it in two directions. The first, and I want to respond directly to your notion of the surveillance state, that the impact that simply knowing that you are being watched, the impact that has on human behaviors, and that impact is profound. The idea of the Panopticon, this was actually goes back to the 1800s. This guy, the social reformer Jeremy Bentham, came up with this idea that the real way to keep prisoners in line is not necessarily to have more guards, but it's to make them believe that they are being watched at all points in time. So long as you hold this out there, that people think there's a good chance they are being watched and observed, they will absolutely change their behaviors. They will conform their behaviors to fall in line with whatever they believe is required of them. So this is a principle that's used in office buildings. This is a principle that's used in hospitals, not just in prisons. But the way I see it as being writ large really comes out in programs like, it gets a little bit into the weeds, but the FINRA, one of the large, it's a regulatory organization for U.S. securities dealers, for broker dealers. They've started this program where they intend to collect every bit of trading data from individual accounts. And they say, oh, no, look, we're not going to be collecting your specific name and social security number and the like. We're just going to collect all of the data, every trade that everyone makes in everyone's account. And we're using this to look for patterns of fraud or what have you. Now, there's a whole other discussion we can have about the misuses of big data and how powerful this database is in the hands of someone who wanted to manipulate markets or predict markets. But the point here is that there is an enormous chilling effect simply from the notion that you are being watched at all times by a regulator. It has the impact in financial markets of advisors and investors, frankly, taking less risks, investing more safely, but with commensurately less reward. It's a chilling effect, and it's very real, and it's just going to become more pronounced in this world where the technology exists to watch or surveil or collect all of the data all of the time.
Yeah, because I don't think people think about this. You know, we get this word transparency tossed out, and everyone's like, oh, transparency, this is like the mother's milk. This is fantastic. This is great. Hold on. Why do two private individuals that are transacting with each other, why does there need to be transparency? Why do we need to pay a bureaucrat, a flunky, essentially, in Washington, D.C. that really doesn't know what they're doing? And even if they had the ability to analyze it, what are they going to do with the analysis? It becomes mind-numbing. Now, people are going to say, Mr. Coveil, you're off in the weeds somewhere. Not really. I just detest this.
It's again, getting into the political level of this. It is the thing that, the phenomenon that concerns me the most. It is a structural change in the way that society interacts with markets. It makes a fetish out of the notion of transparency, and what's lost when you do that with transparency is private information and private opinions, which ultimately that's the engine of markets. The engine of a market is that I think this stock is going up and I want to buy it. You think the stock is not going up, so you want to sell it. The engine of private markets is a difference of opinion, a difference of private opinion. This Panopticon effect, this surveillance effect, whatever you want to call it, it has enormous impacts on the exercise of our private opinion.
Okay, look, you've given a conclusion. I've seen in your writings. You're saying, look, the politicians want, from these regulatory type efforts, a world of pure beta, zero alpha.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. And look, I totally understand that from the perspective of a politician. I mean, there's the old famous saying, this is after World War I, where a French president said, war is too important to be left to the generals. And what he meant by that was that conflict was too important of a political force and who was going to be elected or get in power to be left to people who fought wars for a living. that all of this need to be taken over by by government in order to preserve their position and stability of the state. And it's the same thing with markets today, right? To paraphrase this, markets are too important to be left to investors, or to be left to private investors. Markets are where so much of political legitimacy is found. It's where so much of political strength and power is found. It's like I say, the markets are too important to be left to investors today. At least from the minds. I don't mean a conspiracy here, but I just mean the natural progression of political forces in this modern age.
Well, and I think we could really maybe make the case that the politicians, not until the last 5 years, did they realize they could fully take it over.
I think it has surprised everyone how effective words and politics have been in molding markets and molding behaviors. But I don't want to give the impression that this is a new thing. The same thing happened in the 1930s. It is not an accident that during times of enormous global deleveraging, that there are profound political consequences, usually in the form of fragmentation, both, and I've used this word a couple of times, again, it's kind of a technical word, but we see it every day, both within our own country, but also within other countries and between other countries. And the political ramification of this fragmentation for markets, it's not pretty.
Let me shift gears on you again. The common knowledge game is controlled by the missionary. I want you to define for the audience, from your perspective, what is the common knowledge game and who is the missionary? And the missionary knows they're controlling the common knowledge game, but why don't you define the game and the missionary?
Well, it's interesting, Mike. This goes all the way back to your first point about the crowd watching the crowd, because in game theory, the rules of the crowd watching the crowd, that game, that's called the common knowledge game. And if you look up the common knowledge game on Wikipedia or something like that, you'll always come up with they'll typically give an example of something around the thought experiment, a famous thought experiment called the Island of the Green-Eyed Tribe. So in this thought experiment, let me just kind of set it up for you. It's an island where blue eyes are taboo. If you have blue eyes, if you learn that you have blue eyes, you will get in your canoe and you will leave your island the next morning. Small island, so we all know each other's eye color, but it's also taboo to talk about eye color. So for example, I have blue eyes. So
I have blue eyes.
Okay, great. So you and I have blue eyes. We don't know that we have blue eyes because no one will tell us that we have blue eyes. And also for the purpose of this thought experiment, there are no mirrors on the island. So on this island of the Green-Eyed Tribe, we have perfect private information. Each of us knows everyone else's eye color, but the information is totally private. It's locked in each of our own heads. We can't talk about it with each other. So this tribe can go on living peacefully and happily for generation after generation, even though there are several people on the island like you and me, Mike, who have blue eyes. Until one day a missionary comes. And the missionary, who doesn't care about the taboos about talking about eye color, stands up in front of everyone and says, at least one of you has blue eyes. And the thought experiment is, okay, well, what happens? Well, let's take the trivial example where I'm the only one on the island with blue eyes. And I hear what the missionary says, and so I look around, and I know that all of you have green eyes. And so I say, oh, no, it's me. The missionary must have been talking about me. So I get in my canoe, and I leave the island the next morning. But now let's take the less trivial example of you and I, Mike, we each have blue eyes. And I hear the missionary speak, and I look around, and I go, whew, thank goodness. I see Mike has got blue eyes. He must be the one who the missionary was talking about. And so you can imagine my surprise the next morning when you have not left the island. Why haven't you left the island? As I'm thinking this through, why hasn't Mike left the island? He must have seen that everybody else had green eyes, unless, oh no, he also saw someone with blue eyes. And since I know that everyone else except Mike has green eyes, it must mean that I have blue eyes also. And so, Mike, you and I both leave the island simultaneously on the morning of the second day. And the answer to this thought experiment is that for any n number of people with blue eyes, we all leave simultaneously on the morning of the nth day. All right, so what does this possibly have to do with markets? Well, this is the power of the crowd watching the crowd. It is all of us looking at all of us, and it is driven by common knowledge. Common knowledge is information that all of us believe that all of us have heard. It is the missionary statement. The missionary statement transforms private information into common knowledge. And it's that transformation which gets the ball rolling on the crowd watching the crowd and these common knowledge behaviors. It is exactly the same phenomenon as investors have when the Federal Reserve Chairman gets up and gives a statement about monetary policy. It's exactly the same phenomenon as when John Hilsenrath, formerly of the Wall Street Journal, writes a piece telling you what to think about the Fed monetary policy. The missionary, in this example, is the one who creates the common knowledge, and you do it by using a media microphone. You do it by making a statement that we all believe everyone else has heard. And it doesn't matter what we really think about that statement. It does not matter what we privately think about the validity or the impact of that statement. So long as we think everyone else has heard the statement, we will act as if the statement is true. And that's a very powerful finding across all sorts of human interactions, and it darn sure moves markets. So, who are the modern missionaries? It's the politicians and the bankers. It's the famous journalists. It's the famous investors. It's anyone with access to that media microphone, such that when Warren Buffett says something and it's reported on CNBC, we all believe that everyone has heard it, and that will move markets. So, sorry again for the long-winded response, but I think it deserves some kind of extended explication there.
It's interesting. You bring up famous investors and their position as missionaries, and we see them on CNBC, and you've had some nice notes in your writings about CNBC. And one of the things that I liked that you said is the next time you see a CNBC anchor breathlessly describing the importance of the upcoming data report, complete with a clock ticking down the seconds to its release, I hope you hear that broadcast for what it's really saying, which is kind of what you just were describing. Hey, there's an agenda here. There's an agenda. And so if you're going to choose to play in a game with people, with missionaries that have an agenda that may or may not be aligned with yours, at least be aware of what their agenda is.
Yeah, and that's all I'm saying. Look, it is another version that, the way this game is typically described is the Emperor's New Clothes. In the Emperor's New Clothes, our private information, the information of our own eyes, is the guy is naked. Right? I mean, that's what we're seeing with our own eyes. But this is in the Emperor's New Clothes. The crowd is not really looking at the emperor. The crowd is looking at the crowd, and that's what is driving behavior. And I will tell you, it can be perfectly rational. It is perfectly rational to go along with the crowd. I'm not saying you should stand up here and say, no, I'm going to fight the message, and that's a very quick way to lose a lot of money in a lot of periods of time. What I'm saying, though, is to understand that there's a game being played, to internalize this so that you start to truly believe that the emperor is wearing a fine set of clothes. I think it's very important to maintain that sort of detachment so that you make the choice of whether you want to go along with the crowd or if you want to stay out. But it's to understand what the dynamics of the game that is being played. Like, there's an old saying in poker, right, that if after playing for 30 minutes, you don't know who the sucker is, it's you. Well, this is true in markets as well. And what I'm really trying to say is, it's okay to go along with the games that are being played, but just understand that there is a game being played, and to make that choice not to be the sucker and think that whatever you're being told is truth with a capital T.
I love that. And what I mean by that is I love your inclusion of Kurtz and Willard from Apocalypse Now, and your conclusion, or not your conclusion, but Kurt's ultimate statement. You're an errand boy sent by grocery clerks to collect a bill. Why don't you explain to the audience how that classic excerpt, and I think I'm going to try and play it there so people know it.
Are you an assassin? I'm a soldier. You're neither. You're an errand boy sent by grocery clerks to collect the bill.
But why don't you try and explain to the audience, what were you thinking? What was connecting in your mind? Why was that such a great, relevant? That's a crazy, crazy classic piece of filmmaking. Brando was fabulously off his rocker. But why did you want to include that in your writing about markets and game theory?
Well, I tell you, the focus of that particular note was a note I wrote called "Hollow World, Hollow Markets, Hollow Men," and I think that this is something that almost all of us feel, that there is a hollowness to the world today, that it's been hollowed out, both mechanistically in terms of, and I'll just talk about markets, where so much of the market activity today, my data is about 80% of all the trades that happen in markets today are just machines talking to machines, either for some notion of split-second or microsecond arbitrage opportunities, or rebalancing programs, liquidity providers, machines talking to machines. That only a small fraction of what actually takes place in markets is human beings making a decision that they want to own or sell a fractional ownership in a real-world company. We see this in our politics. So much of what happens politically seems, to me at least, to be such the kabuki theater, to be such a shadow of shadows, to be an elaborate dance with very little real-world meaning to it. And I use the Apocalypse Now references because what I think you see in Willard and Kurtz are two very different responses to the horror, to the hollowness of the conflict, the Vietnam War that both of those men found themselves in. Kurtz's response, the Marlon Brando's character's response, was to flee into the jungle and create his own kingdom, his own world. The heart of darkness, as Conrad described it in his short story or his novella that led to the making of Apocalypse Now. And in this heart of darkness, in his own little kingdom, this was his attempt to withdraw from the world. Willard, on the other hand, the Martin Sheen character, the clerk sent to collect the bill, as Brando described it, he recognizes the hollowness, but he still tries to be part of that world. And I think that no matter how romantic it can be to think that we are going to withdraw from the world, from this hollow world, this hollow market that we are engaged in, most of us don't have that luxury. Most of us, to provide for our family, for ourselves, whatever our rationale is, have to still engage in this hollow world. And I think the challenge is, how do you survive? How do you function within a hollow world without withdrawing and going crazy like Kurtz did? It's not easy. but this is what I'm describing, where I say that I think it's important that the crucial part of surviving this hollow world is at least to recognize the games that are being played and not to internalize them and become a true believer in the games. But I also think it's difficult for most of it, at least, to flee into the jungle and create our own little mad kingdoms. So that was the point. I think I hope I described it better in the note than I did just then.
Well, spot on. In fact, let's direct people to your main site as we wrap up. Where is the best place, Ben, where they can go to, the audience can go to read more about the Epsilon Theory, all your papers that have come out since, I guess, the summer of 13 would be with the starting point?
That's right. Been doing this right at 1 year now, and it's been so gratifying, the chord that it struck with so many people. The best place to go is EpsilonTheory.com. I am the Chief Risk Officer for Salient Partners. We are an asset manager based in Houston, Texas. So you can also find this at the Salient Partners website. But just Google or search for Epsilon Theory, just like the Greek letter, EpsilonTheory.com. Do a search there, and it'll take you right to, as I think you described at the outset here, I've written a lot of notes by now. I love to do it. I write a lot. Everything's completely free, of course, and be delighted to have any of your listeners sign up and come on board for hearing more about what I've got to say.
Yeah, given that you use so many pop culture references too, I'm fully expecting, if it's not already been in one of them and I missed it, I'm expecting something from Full Metal Jacket at some point in time.
I watched the movie just the other night, in fact, to refresh on that. Absolutely.
Hey, Ben, listen, it was good chatting. Nice meeting you, and hopefully we can talk again in the future.
My pleasure, Mike. Anytime. Thank you.
Bye-bye. I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.